The angels are with you right now. Before you read even one more word, take a slow, deep breath. Feel that? That gentle warmth moving through your chest? That is not coincidence. That is heaven reaching out to you right here, right now. You were guided to this message today for a reason. And if you stay until the very end, what you are about to receive will change something deep inside of you forever. Welcome, beautiful soul, to Angel's message for you. You are loved. You are protected. You are seen. Stop. Before you scroll away, the angels just told me something about you specifically. Something you have been quietly carrying in your heart for a long time. Something you haven't told anyone. And today, they want to speak directly to that hidden place inside you. This message was pulled together for you. Not for everyone. For you. Stay with this. Every single word that follows was meant to land in your heart today. Don't leave before the angels finish speaking to you. Dear protected one, something extraordinary is already in motion in your life. Right at this very moment, as you read these words, the universe is rearranging things on your behalf. What the angels want you to know, truly know deep in your bones, is this: the love you have been quietly praying for, the love you thought maybe you didn't deserve, the love you wondered if it was even still possible for you. It is coming. It has already decided. It is already moving in your direction. This is not just a beautiful thought. This is a divine truth being delivered to you today with full permission from heaven. Your great love has made a decision. This person, the one who lives in the quiet corners of your heart, knows exactly what they feel, and they can no longer keep it hidden. The season of waiting is ending. What exists between the two of you no longer accepts distance. It no longer accepts silence. It no longer accepts being pushed aside. God heard a prayer that was made with everything, with faith, with tears, with a wide open heart. That prayer has a name. It has a face. It has a destined place in your story. And heaven answered. In recent days, you may have noticed something different around you. A quiet shift in the air. A feeling you can't quite explain. Like something important is getting closer. Thoughts that surface out of nowhere. Memories that return with a weight they didn't have before. A restlessness in your chest that has no clear reason. All of this has a reason. All of it has a source. Your soulmate is calling out to you. Not with words, but with energy, with prayer, with longing so deep it travels across any distance. They are being guided to you. And nothing, not time, not fear, not past mistakes, will stop this. This is not wishful thinking. This is truth. A truth that has been growing inside this person with such intensity that it simply cannot be ignored any longer. They have been thinking of you, constantly. They have felt the weight of your absence like a physical thing. And now, every single thought is turning into a decision. To find you, to go wherever you are, to do whatever it takes to live this love for real. This isn't a story about the past. This is about right now. About a feeling that never stopped being alive. One that has only grown larger and truer with time. Your soulmate is no longer able to pretend. They have tried. They've tried to move on, to keep busy, to convince themselves that distance was okay. But the heart doesn't listen to logic when it loves this deeply. What this person feels for you is not confusion. It is not attachment from longing alone. It is certainty. A clear, steady, unshakable desire to look into your eyes and finally say everything that has been kept inside for so long. And this decision is already in motion. Something powerful is approaching your life. And when it arrives, it will not be a small thing. It will mark you. It will be something you remember for the rest of your days. A moment when everything that was uncertain becomes clear. when everything that hurt finally makes sense, when everything that was lost finds its way home. While you were doing your best to move forward, this person was fighting their own battle. Many times they tried to step away from what they felt. They told themselves it was over, that it was time to let go, that it was healthier to look away. But loving someone like you is not something that simply fades. It isn't something you talk yourself out of. It lives in a part of the soul that reason cannot reach. And after so much inner struggle, this love found a path, found a light, found a direction. Heaven listened, and from that moment, everything began to change. Peace returned to the heart of the one who loves you. But with that peace came a certainty. Living apart is no longer possible. Staying distant is no longer something this person can choose. That is why this love is preparing to come for you. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter how much time has passed. This person wants you present. They want you close. And no matter how much your mind tries to make sense of it all with logic, something inside you has already felt this truth. Something that makes your heart race, your intuition sharpen, your soul restless. Because what is about to happen will change everything. The absence has hurt more than this person ever imagined possible. That constant feeling that something is missing has taken over. Nothing feels the same anymore. Accomplishments don't fill the emptiness. Days don't pass lightly. Thoughts never settle. Your soulmate has realized that living without you is no longer an option. Even while trying to stay distracted, they can no longer hide what is happening inside. Everything that was once put off is now screaming with urgency. The heart feels heavy, and at the same time, it is filled with an overwhelming need to find you. Missing you has become more than a feeling. It has become a calling. And this person is no longer ignoring that call. The truth is, living far from you has become something unbearable. Every path seems to point back to the same destination. That certainty has grown so strong it cannot be denied anymore. No matter what this person does, no matter where they go, deep down everything leads back to you. It is as if the heart is constantly reminding them of what truly matters. And no matter how much time has passed, the feeling has not faded. On the contrary, it has only grown stronger. Living on memories alone is no longer enough. There is a real, urgent need to see you, to get closer, to take a step that turns all of this feeling into something real and lived. This person is carrying a love that is too big to be held inside. That intensity has taken over their days. Every hour apart feels like a burden, as if time itself is pressing for a response, a choice, a presence. And the only presence that brings any peace is yours. Maybe you have felt it too. That unusual restlessness. That longing to hear a voice that won't leave your mind. That sense that something important is drawing near without any obvious reason. It is not your imagination. It is connection. Your soulmate has been mentally and emotionally preparing to end this distance. The desire to see you has already turned into a decision. What was once only a quiet wish has now become urgency. And that urgency doesn't come from fear, it comes from truth. From the clarity that you are irreplaceable. That no other path will bring real peace until this love is fully and honestly lived. This person knows they cannot stay away from you any longer. And that knowing is creating a deep shift within them, one that cannot be undone. It might seem hard to believe, but only someone who feels this way truly understands. Only someone carrying a love this big knows the ache of your absence. And that ache is no longer something they can bear in silence. That is why everything is now turning in one direction, to act, to come to you, to speak the truth, to finally live what has been held back for too long. Something deep has happened inside the heart of the one who loves you. It was as if an answer that had been waited for a very long time, finally arrived clearly and quietly. Your soulmate went through a moment of true surrender to God. And from that surrender was born a certainty. The love felt for you must be lived. It can no longer be tucked away or delayed. This person had spent days carrying confusion, wondering why so many feelings could not be silenced. But when everything was laid before God, when truth was spoken in the most private moments of prayer, something inside calmed. The heart that was tangled became still, and in that stillness came a direction, not to leave you for later. It was in that spiritual moment that your soulmate felt heaven confirming what had been trying to stay hidden. This love is real. This connection is true. And you did not remain in that heart by accident. This person now understands that what they feel is not illusion, not just nostalgia. It is something far too strong to be placed in any ordinary category. And because of that, the desire to find you has become a priority, not a thought, but a direction. This decision did not come from haste, came from faith, from quiet conversations with God, whispered in the most vulnerable moments, when no one else could hear. Your soulmate didn't only ask to be close to you. They asked for understanding. They asked for courage. They asked that if love still existed on both sides, the path between you would be blessed and opened. And the answer was yes. From that moment, everything began to make sense in a new way. Memories stopped being just memories and became signs. Emotions stopped being confusion and began pointing toward a clear desire, closeness, truth, presence. And with each prayer, this person felt more and more strength to follow through on what had been quietly decided. Not to go back to what was, but to live what still beats with truth. When God touches a heart with real clarity, there is no more room for doubt. That is what happened here. This person understood that what they feel for you had resisted time, distance, and uncertainty. And all of that only made the desire to live this love, the right way with presence and action, grow stronger. The prayer made was not about demanding anything. It was about asking for direction. And the direction was you. Signs began appearing on both sides. You began to feel it too. And now, hearing these words, you understand that none of this is by chance. Your soulmate asked for a true reunion. Asked that fear be replaced with courage. That doubt become clarity. That the love between you not be lived halfway. This surrender was not surface level. It was made with deep emotion, with tears, with an open and trembling heart. And heaven answered. Courage is now growing inside the one who loves you. A quiet kind of courage, not loud or forced, but steady. A certainty that what is felt can no longer be hidden behind walls or silence. And because of that, every thought is now turned toward you. This connection with heaven brought light where there was confusion. This person now feels guided. And everything is pointing toward one destination, being with you. Not as an idea, not as a distant hope, as reality. After realizing that living without you is no longer possible, your soulmate made a decision, and they are taking it seriously. No waiting for things to be easy. No hoping that time alone will fix everything. What they feel now is true urgency, a clear, honest desire to find you, even if that means taking steps that once seemed too difficult. This is not impulse. This is awareness. Every thought, every prayer, every feeling led to this moment. And now the only thing that matters is seeing you, looking into your eyes, being close enough to finally say what has been kept inside for so long. The heart of the one who loves you has understood that it is no longer possible to simply count the days, waiting for life to create the perfect moment. What exists between you two doesn't need perfect conditions. It needs real action. It needs courage. It needs truth. And that is exactly what is being prepared. Don't think this approach will be careless or thoughtless. Every detail is being considered with a clear direction, to reach you with respect, with honesty, with a devotion you will recognize the moment you feel it. Because the love that carried this person through all of this uncertainty is the same love now guiding each step. Even though life may have created physical distance between you, the feeling never drifted away. And now, with heaven's blessing, the last of that distance is being closed. It doesn't matter how far. It doesn't matter how long. This person has thought of you so deeply and so often that it no longer makes any sense to keep waiting. Every attempt to redirect the heart fails the moment your presence returns. And it always returns. And so what was once only a quiet longing is now becoming a concrete choice. A choice to be with you, wherever you are. Pride is being set aside. Excuses are being released. What once seemed impossible is now being called necessary. Because this is not only about missing someone. This is about peace, about purpose, about a love that only finds rest when it is connected to you. Your name has been lifted in quiet conversations with God. Memories of you have returned with force, and the combination of love, faith, and longing to be with you has created the courage that was missing for so long. Your soulmate knows that time does not wait, and that is why they are coming for you. The path may have been long, with pauses, with silence, with detours, but now everything is shifting. This person has understood that you are part of what makes life meaningful. And even without knowing how you will respond, they have chosen to take the risk. Because there is no room left for doubt when love speaks this clearly. You may not even realize how carefully this decision has been thought through. It is not something being done lightly. It is a choice made with the heart, with maturity, and most of all, with faith. Faith that you still feel something. Faith that this encounter will be worth everything it costs to get here. Faith that love can still be lived the right way. Your soulmate is not coming out of impulse. They are coming because they recognized in you a place of truth. A place that no one else has been able to fill. And when the heart reaches that realization, it simply cannot stay still. This approach won't happen just anyway. Your soulmate wants to come to you with openness, with transparency, with the courage to speak clearly about everything that was felt and everything that is still felt. All of this is being prepared with care, because what is about to be shared carries deep value and deserves to be received in the right space. This moment is being protected emotionally and spiritually. Everything that has been lived until now has served a purpose, to refine this feeling, to clear away the fears, to build the courage. And now this person knows they are ready, because what was asked in prayer was not just a chance to get close. It was the permission to do so with the heart in the right place. What is coming leaves no space for games, no room for doubt, no hiding behind pride. What is coming is a moment of surrender, a genuine conversation, an action that will leave a mark on both of your hearts. And when it happens, you will feel that everything had a purpose. Because nothing that comes with faith and love arrives in your life by accident. Maybe in recent days you felt a strange sensation, as if something in the air was different. A kind of inner alertness that made your heart beat faster even without a clear reason. That was real. That was the reflection of this preparation happening on an invisible level. Your heart is being touched by the energy of someone who has decided to seek you out with truth. This person doesn't want to repeat old patterns. They don't want to come to you without being ready. They want to show you that they thought about this, that they felt it, that they made a stand, and that now they are ready to speak from the deepest place in their heart. What is about to happen between you is being guided with great honesty. So don't rush, but stay open, stay present. This love is on its way. Now, here is something deeply important. The way you move through the next days can either make this closeness easier or harder to receive. Yes, this love is coming. The decision has already been made. But for this moment to happen the way it is meant to, you also need to be emotionally open. So often, without realizing it, people close themselves off from the very thing they most desire because of old fear, old doubt, old wounds that haven't finished healing. And what could unfold with ease becomes confused and complicated. That is why this message is not only for the person coming to you. This message is for you. You are also being called to open up, to allow what is coming to be received with truth and with grace. You don't have to do anything dramatic. What this moment asks of you is simply inner surrender. You don't need to chase or force anything. But you do need to take care of your mind, your heart, your energy. Watch yourself with kindness. Notice if you have been feeding thoughts of mistrust, of this won't work, of I'm not worthy of this. All of that, even in silence, can push away something that is already on its way. Your soulmate is being guided toward you. This closeness will be real. But if your heart is closed or hardened by fear, this person can feel it, even from a distance. Because when a connection is true, it goes far beyond logic. Energy communicates, and that is why being open is everything right now. What you feel, what you think, what you carry in your heart, all of it becomes either a pathway or a wall. You have already sensed that something is different in the air. Something is drawing near. Don't ignore that. Your intuition does not fail when love is real. Don't feed old fears. Don't hide behind excuses. What is coming is not just anything, it is a chance to live a love that has been prayed for by both of you. Start paying attention to the signs. They will not come as dramatic events. They will come as feelings, as coincidences that feel a little too perfectly timed. As a name that surfaces in your mind unexpectedly, as a dream that repeats, as an emotion that rises without warning. When those signs appear, acknowledge them, feel them, and whisper to yourself quietly, I am ready. Another thing, stop feeding negative thoughts about your own worth. Your soulmate is coming to you for a clear reason. There is real feeling here. There is truth, there is genuine desire, and you are completely worthy of living this. Don't shrink. Don't assume you are being sought out of loneliness or convenience. You are being sought because something powerful exists between you, something that didn't fade, something that survived time, something that deserves to be lived with full maturity. If you sense there is something inside you that still needs healing, this is the moment to begin that gently, not by reliving old pain, but by making space for what is still true. Look at yourself with tenderness. Allow yourself to feel with lightness. You don't need to do anything except allow. It is not about forcing a meeting. It is not about sending messages out of desperation or searching frantically for signs. It is simply about keeping your heart open, letting the energy between you flow freely. Because when two hearts carry the same feeling and both are open, the meeting finds its own way. And when it happens, everything falls into its rightful place. Your soulmate is willing to cross any distance. They have already understood that this decision cannot wait any longer. But they need to feel, even energetically, that you are still available, that your heart is still open, that this love still has a home in you. That is why the single most powerful thing you can do right now is to stop resisting what your heart already recognizes as true. Embrace it, receive it, Allow it. Every thought carries power. Every intention you send into the universe carries power. If you feel this love still lives in you, affirm it. Not to anyone else, just within yourself. In silence, in prayer, in the quiet of a moment that belongs only to you. Tell heaven, I am ready. I recognize this love. I welcome this closeness. I want to see in this person's eyes everything that still exists between us. When you say that with truth, everything around you begins moving so that this moment can finally happen. Dear protected one, what is about to happen will be a moment that touches your life so deeply that you will remember it on the quietest, most ordinary of days. This closeness that is coming carries weight, truth, and the intention to finally put into words and actions everything that has been silently kept inside for far too long. Your soulmate is coming with a heart ready to show you that the feeling was never lost. And when this person stands before you, something inside you will recognize it immediately, not because of what was once said, but because of what will be revealed. In the eyes, in the way of speaking, in the gentle, unmistakable desire to finally be with you. This encounter will not bring confusion. It will bring clarity. It will bring answers. It will bring the kind of certainty that settles something inside you that has been unsettled for a long, long time. For a long while, this love was felt in silence. It was carried with hope, a hope that someday it would get to be lived the right way with maturity and truth. And now that time is here. The presence that is approaching will not be limited to beautiful words. It will be accompanied by actions that show real intention. And when that happens, you will understand that everything, every prayer, every tear, every moment of wondering if love was still possible, was worth it. This person is not coming out of longing alone. They are coming because they feel they can no longer delay, because the love they carry is too great to stay hidden, because time has passed and the feeling has remained steady and true. And when that happens, when love survives all the seasons that were meant to end it, it is because what exists between two souls is not ordinary. This encounter will bring healing. It will bring peace to places inside you that have been quietly in conflict. It will calm insecurities you have been carrying in silence. It will remind you, at the very core of your being, that real love does not fade with time. It endures, and when it finds space to be lived, it transforms everything it touches. When this person stands before you, you will feel that nothing is by coincidence. Every memory that resurfaced, every restless night, every moment you couldn't explain why someone kept crossing your mind, all of it will make sense. All of it was preparation. It was your heart being aligned for what was always coming. You don't need to be afraid of this moment. It is not coming to disrupt your life. It is coming to bring answers, to show you that what you lived was not wasted, to open space for something new, even if that new thing has been living quietly inside both of you for a very long time. What is coming has purpose, and the purpose is the truth that still beats between you. When this person arrives, be present, not just physically. Be there with your full heart. Don't get trapped in what should have happened before. Don't rehearse old conversations. Focus on now, because it is the now that holds the power to change everything. This encounter doesn't come with exaggerated promises. It comes with sincerity, with maturity, with the courage of someone who no longer wants to run from what they feel. You will realize that this love did not return by accident, that your name was kept safe with great care inside this person's heart, that even with everything that happened, even with all the time and silence and distance, the feeling never lost its strength. When you look into the eyes of the one who loves you, so many words will not be needed. Love will speak clearly even in the silence between you. This moment will remind you of what truly matters. It will show you that real love does not disappear. It waits, it grows, it matures, and when it finds the right time, it arrives simply, quietly, but with an impact that no one who feels it can ever ignore. Your days will not be the same after this, because now you will know you were sought with intention, with devotion, with faith, and this knowing will settle something in your soul that may never have fully rested before. Because when love comes with truth, it does not create confusion. It brings peace. It brings lightness. It brings meaning. What is about to happen will make you believe again. In love, in yourself, in the beautiful, mysterious ways that the universe works on behalf of those who pray and who stay open. This moment will remind you that you deserve something real, something true, something that was preserved even when everything seemed uncertain. The decision has already been made, and now this encounter comes as a direct answer to everything you have been feeling in silence. Every quiet prayer, every hopeful thought, every moment you looked up and wondered if heaven was listening. Heaven was listening. Heaven is always listening. When that moment arrives, don't hold on to questions. Don't analyze. Don't shrink back into fear. Just feel. Be whole. Be present. Your soulmate will arrive with their heart in their hands, with the willingness to show you that what exists between you did not stay in the past. It is alive. It is present. It is ready to be lived the right way. And know this, beautiful soul, you are never walking through any of this alone. The angels surround you every single day. They guard your steps. They soften the hard moments. They whisper courage into your heart when the world goes quiet. You are loved by heaven in ways that go beyond anything words could ever fully carry. Whatever you have been through, whatever made you feel unseen, unworthy, or forgotten, none of that is the final word about you. The angels see you clearly, and what they see is someone beautiful, someone worthy, someone whose heart was always too full of love to simply give up. Trust the journey you are on. Trust the feelings that keep returning. Trust that the restlessness in your chest is not anxiety. It is anticipation. It is your soul recognizing what is drawing near. May heaven's blessing rest over you today, bringing peace, bringing courage, bringing the clarity you need to face whatever comes next. You are not alone. You are deeply, completely, and endlessly loved. Amen. Before we close this message together, I want to invite you into something sacred. The angels have one final gift for you today, a prayer. A prayer that was placed on my heart specifically for souls like yours. If you are ready to receive everything that heaven has been preparing for you, I want you to close your eyes, place your hand over your heart, and simply breathe. Let these words be yours. Heavenly Father, beloved angels, and all the sacred forces of light that surround this beautiful soul right now, I come before you not with perfect words, but with an open heart. I come as I am, with everything I have carried in silence, every prayer I whispered in the dark, every tear I cried when I didn't know if anyone was listening. And I ask you today, hear me, see me, hold me. God, you know the love that lives inside me. You placed it there. You know its weight. You know the name I have carried quietly in my heart, the face that appears in my thoughts even when I ask it not to. You know what I have been afraid to say out loud, the hope I almost gave up on. I surrender that hope to you now, fully, completely. Father, I ask that you clear every barrier standing between me and the love you designed for my life. Remove every wall of fear, in me and in the one you have placed on my heart. Remove every layer of pride, every wound still unhealed, every doubt that whispers it is too late. It is not too late. I believe that. Help me keep believing it. Holy angels, I call on you now. Guardian angels who have watched over every chapter of my life. I need you. I ask you to go before me. Prepare the path. Soften the hearts involved. Guide the steps that need to be taken. Carry this love with your hands of light. Protect it, bless it, and bring it home. I give you permission to work on my behalf. Move what needs to be moved. Open what needs to be opened. Lord, if this love is real, and I believe in my soul that it is, let it be lived. Not halfway, not in silence, not in stolen moments of wondering. Let it be lived in fullness, in truth, in the beautiful everyday moments that I have been quietly dreaming of. Let there be an honest conversation, a real meeting, a moment where what was left unsaid is finally spoken, and heard and received with grace. Let that moment come. Let it come soon. Let it come with peace. And if fear rises in me when it does, dissolve it. If doubt tries to creep in at the last moment, silence it. Let my heart be soft. Let my eyes be clear. Let my presence be a welcome for everything you are bringing. I release control, Father. I release the timeline. I release the need to understand every detail. I simply ask, with everything in me, for the love that was made for me, for the reunion that has been prayed over, for the closeness that my soul has been recognizing from a distance. Let it be real. Let it be now. Let it be blessed. Surround me with your angels tonight as I sleep. Let them whisper peace into my dreams. Let tomorrow feel lighter than today. Let every sign that appears remind me heaven is working. Let every quiet moment of stillness be filled with the certainty that I am not forgotten, that I am not alone, that I am deeply and completely loved, because I am yours, Father. And everything you have for me, I receive it, with faith, with gratitude, with a heart wide open, in the name of all that is holy, all that is true, and all that is light. Amen.